So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Outdoor Living. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I installed some artificial grass in my backyard. This video is going to go over everything, including how I measured out what I needed as far as square footage, how I got the grass to my backyard from my driveway, grade preparation, laying landscaping fabric down to help prevent weeds, how to make the cuts, because I did have several cuts that I had to make because I was going around some horseshoe pits and a raised planter that was curved. I'm also going to go over how I seamed multiple pieces of the grass together because the roll was only 15 foot wide and the majority of the area that I was doing was wider than that. What I used and how I anchored down the grass as far as landscaping stakes. I'm also going to go over what I used for an infill and how I spread that around. Now, I did use a regular broom at first, and then I ended up going and getting a landscaping rake that was specifically made to spread that infill in the grass. And I'm going to let you know how that worked as well. And during all this, I'm going to go over mistakes I made, so hopefully you don't make those same mistakes that I did. So here is a chapter index of what takes place in this video and at what times they happen. So if you don't need to watch the whole thing, you can bypass what you don't need to see so I don't waste your time. And let's get to it. So one thing I did not take into consideration, and in all the research I did on installing artificial grass, was this ever mentioned, is you can totally see the seam where it goes from the 15-foot full piece of artificial grass to the other little pieces that I cut out. Now you'll notice the one piece is not as noticeable, and that's because that piece of grass is going the same direction as the main piece of grass, meaning there is a grain to this artificial grass. Now, hopefully over time, and the more it stands up and wears in, it might all blend in a little better. Now, this was by far the biggest oversight that I had during this process. The rest of it went pretty smoothly, besides a couple small setbacks that I will explain later in this video. Now, this is my first time ever laying artificial grass, and for the most part, I am happy with the end result. So to have you get a basic concept of how much artificial grass I actually laid here, this is just over 700 square feet. From the back of that horseshoe pit to the back of this horseshoe pit, it's right around 46 feet. And then my widest point was about 20 feet wide to the raised planter from the PVC drain at the patio. So my idea is to get a full piece of grass to go from the back of that to the back of this horseshoe pit, and then use the cutouts from that horseshoe pit and this horseshoe pit to fill in these three areas around my raised planter. So right here you can see this artificial grass came in a 15-foot width, and you can see the seam right there. So these three pieces are each about 9 feet long, and the middle one is 6 feet wide, then that one's 5 feet, and this one is 4 feet wide. So I used one of the horseshoe pit cutouts to do that piece, and then my thought is getting this little bit smaller piece and this smaller piece out of the other horseshoe pit. When I calculated that, it didn't quite work out as I had hoped, and I was going to be a little short. So when I ordered it, I figured if I got an extra 2 feet past the horseshoe pit, then I would have enough material to do that. However, you can see they actually shorted me a foot. It's only overhanging by a foot instead of 2 foot. Because of that, I was able to cut the one piece for this bigger section out of the one horseshoe pit, but I was not able to get both of these pieces out of the other horseshoe pit because they shorted me that foot. And that is why I have one extra seam right here that I had to cut out from another miscellaneous piece I had. So when I originally built these horseshoe pits, we didn't quite know what we were going to put in our yard. And I did not put any type of a divider in front of the sand pit of the horseshoe pit. So what I ended up deciding to do is I had some more leftover pavers from when I did the horseshoe pit, and I decided to come out a little bit in front of it because we have had a couple errant throws go short, and I didn't want that possibly hitting my grass in the future. So I decided to come out a couple feet and then go across with another layer of pavers to make a divider from the grass to the horseshoe pit. Now I will go into more detail on laying these pavers in the actual horseshoe pit build, which there is videos on every aspect of that, except for the pavers. I haven't quite got that one done yet. So my plan was to go pick up our artificial grass at the location we purchased it, but they said it was going to be a $65 delivery fee, no matter whether they got it to their yard or just dropped it off in front of our house. So that's what we ended up doing. I told the wife to see if they'd drop it in our side yard because I wasn't going to be able to make it home from work to help get it in the backyard. And they said for liability reasons they would not, and they basically dumped it in the street in front of our house. My daughter had a good idea of tying a ratchet strap around it and pulling it with the truck, at least to get it behind the gate until I could get home and help them move it. Once I got home, we had to come up with a way to get it all the way to our backyard, and pushing it was not going to be an option. And obviously we didn't have enough room to roll it that way. So what I ended up doing is having a couple extra wheels that I was able to throw a rod through, and then using a dolly, I leveraged it up, set it on that rod. I did the same thing with a heavy-duty four-wheel dolly on the other side, and that way we were able to push and steer that turf out of my side yard and around to the backyard. Once I got it close to where I needed to have it, I went ahead and used that dolly to leverage it up again and pull the cart and the wheels out from underneath it. So the first step in laying artificial grass is your grade preparation, and it's by far the most critical aspect of laying this grass as well. And one of the most critical parts of grade preparation is making sure you drain correctly. So right here you can see this is a picture of the area where I'm going to be doing the grass. Basically what I was trying to do is drain everything from the raised planter down to that plastic drain pipe that bleeds off through the front yard. So here's a picture of my yard after a rainstorm. So right here you can see that most of the flow is already heading the right direction. I'm pretty dry up by the raised planter, but I've got a big puddle right towards the drainage pipe. So my flow in the yard is already pretty much set. I just need to add a little bit more material so that instead of getting a big puddle, it drains directly off into the PVC drainage. So being as though this was my first time laying artificial grass, I did do some research on this, and they actually said a good rule of thumb is that you should excavate down 3 inches with your subgrade from your final grade height, and you should backfill that with either a crushed rock base or a decomposed granite. They say depending on your subgrade and what it is, you could go as little as 2 inches, or you might need to go as much as 4 to 6 inches if you have a lot of clay in your ground. So I'm going to go over a quick history of the subgrade that I have in this backyard, and it all kind of ties into what I had done. About 5 years ago, I had a 20 by 50 foot concrete patio poured in my backyard. At the time that was done, I actually had Bermuda grass in this whole area. Honestly, I don't recommend anybody putting in real Bermuda grass. I had that stuff growing everywhere where I didn't want it to go, and then even after excavating it 5 years ago, I'm still trying to fight some areas of getting rid of it. Now, being as though I removed that Bermuda grass over 5 years ago, and that's when I put that 1/4 inch minus granite in there, it's been compacted over time. Whereas if you freshly excavated out the area where you're putting the artificial grass, you need to be more cautious and be more critical about the compaction. So therefore, you would want to lay a little bit of the 1/4 inch minus down, then compact it, then lay another layer and compact it again. Now you'll notice at first, I was using just an 8-foot 2x4 to kind of spread that gravel and disperse it, and then I went over it with the compactor. I'd rake it a little bit on high spots, then do that wood screed again, wet it down, then go over it with the plate compactor again, and I repeated that process until I thought I had all the high spots and low spots removed and that I was pretty flat. I used a hand tamper to go around my horseshoe pits where the pavers were because I didn't want to risk hitting them with the plate compactor and pushing them out of place. I cut a little 90-degree corner out of a piece of scrap wood, and I used that to set my final grade a 1/2 inch below that PVC drain. So here's where I made my first big mistake for this project. We actually got our artificial grass delivered on Thursday. However, we had ordered some weed barrier control fabric from Amazon, and it had not been delivered yet. But we were so excited to see what this grass was going to look like. Even though we didn't have the fabric down, we decided to roll it out and kind of see what it was going to look like. So this ended up being a good and a bad thing. The good thing about it is when we rolled it out and kind of stood on top of it and played around on it that night, we actually noticed that our grade was not flat enough, and we had a couple low spots and high spots that we needed to fix. The bad thing that ended up happening is since we rolled it out, then we decided to make a couple cuts and start contouring it around the horseshoe pit and the raised planter. The problem with this was once we made those cuts, which came out very well, and it was fitting perfectly on Friday afternoon, when we rolled it back up and went to lay it out on Saturday, it just didn't fit as good, and we had a couple small gaps that I'm going to show you later in this video. So I had a lot of cuts that I needed to do around this curved raised planter that I built a long time ago, and I was a little worried about it, but it actually went smoother than I thought it would. What I did at first is just cut the majority of the artificial grass off, because with less material it made it a lot easier to make a more accurate cut at the end. Then what I did is I took either a razor knife, or I was also using a pair of straight tin snips, worked well to cut this artificial grass, and I cut slits from the excess down to where it met the ground. Then I was able to contour it right around the curves and see exactly where it met with the ground. Now, being as though I did have the concern of we were pulling it back up that evening and getting it out of the way so we could lay the landscaping fabric, I did not do the final cut on this edge, and it's a good thing I didn't. We did go ahead and make the cut around the pavers at the front of the horseshoe pit. We just used a razor knife to do this. My wife just lifted up on the piece of grass that we were cutting out while I made the cut, and that went very smoothly with a knife. You will need a lot of blades to do these cuts because they do dull out quickly. So we did end up getting our landscaping fabric delivered that night. So in the morning we went ahead and pushed the artificial grass back up onto the patio to get it out of the way. I ended up making a 16-foot wood screed to help with the grade to make sure I was pretty flat overall. I basically screwed together two 8-foot lengths of wood and then put some stiffeners on each end to make it easier to drag. I also took a little corner out of the one side so I could rest that on my drainage, and that would set my gap for the finished grade along that edge. So I was using the plastic drainage tube as a guide on the patio side. On the other side, we didn't really use a guide. I was just using the ground level. The reason I was able to do that is because my ground was pretty well compacted. So obviously, depending on your application, this probably won't work as far as running the screed along the ground. So at the end of this video, I have another video on how I did my pavers, and this will show other ways of setting up a wood screed and different options as far as doing it. We did this a little bit at a time and pulled and filled material as needed. You don't want to build up a huge amount of gravel behind it because it just makes it more awkward to pull. However, you do want a little pile of material because then as you drag it, it just fills in those gaps as needed and you can just work it right along. So right here, I'm doing the final compaction on this area. After finishing that, I did use a stiff bristled push broom to smooth out the transition where I could not use the wood screed, and also just to go over it one more time to make sure I didn't feel any big lumps, divots, or high spots. I made sure I was happy with that grade, and then I had to actually cut my wood screed because it was too long for this final area. Then we went in and screeded out that final area and then used the push broom to smooth out the transitions around the horseshoe pit. Then it was time to lay the landscaping fabric. Now my wife ordered a 6-foot by 300-foot roll of this material, which was about 3 times too much. So what I decided to do is go ahead and double layer the material. I didn't fold it out to 6 foot, we just laid it in the 3-foot increments. So I overlaid my material by about 6 inches, so I was double layered at the seams. You can use either a razor knife or just a good pair of scissors usually to cut this material. So I used to just cut off the excess material around corners and stuff, but what I realized is instead of wasting that material, what I do is just make a slit to that edge and then fold it back and nail it down. So it's just adding an extra layer of protection instead of wasting that material. So I'm sure they make specific nails for this landscaping fabric. I just used some leftover nails from another project that had a pretty wide head on them so they wouldn't just rip through the fabric. And we were able to push those down basically by hand through the fabric and into the ground. So our grade was good. We laid the landscaping fabric. Now it's time to go ahead and roll that artificial grass into place. So since we had already made the cuts around the horseshoe pit the night before, we got that artificial grass laid out and pulled it into place as best we could. But as I told you previously, that ended up being a mistake because we just couldn't get it to line up exactly and come out as nice as it did the night before. So we did have a couple small gaps around the horseshoe pit. There's nothing we could really do about it at this point. This is the other horseshoe pit after we had already laid that all out, got it as best we could. So I basically used a sharp razor knife for any long straight cuts, and I always just went a little long to start with because I could always trim a little bit off. So this artificial grass does have a grain to it. Right here I'm going with the grain making a cut, and there is lines you can follow when going the one direction. When you're going cross grain, it is a little bit more difficult to cut, so you might keep that in mind when laying your grass, because it might make longer cuts easier if you go with the grain versus cross grain. So right here we're staking down the grass towards the front of that PVC drain. The reason I started at this point is obviously this is right off my patio. It is going to be the most visible side, so I wanted to make sure I had the cleanest edge. Now, one problem I did have is I had actually concreted that PVC drain in place, so I had to put these nails in at an angle so I would miss the concrete. So here's the landscaping stakes that I ended up purchasing off of Amazon. They were packs of 225. I figured one pack was going to be plenty. However, we ran out and I had to order a second box. It was recommended to go every 3 to 4 inches with a stake around the edge. Now I did do that, especially at the front edge. Then I went probably every 6 inches around the edges everywhere else. My thought process behind this was most of the abuse was going to take place right at this front edge as people were walking onto the grass. And especially the dogs, because they go terrorizing out the back door right onto the grass. So I wanted that to be nice and stout, so hopefully I never have a problem with that coming up right there. The rest of it I wasn't too worried about. I was debating on putting it in the center of the synthetic grass, but after watching the dogs for a couple weekends, I just didn't think it was necessary. Now, because I had to put these landscaping stakes in at such an angle, I was a little worried that the 6 inches wasn't going to be quite long enough and it wasn't biting into the dirt good enough. However, after putting a small handful of them in, I did feel it was grabbing good enough and holding it tight enough where I wasn't worried about it. I had gone on Amazon and they actually sell these stakes up to 12 inches long if necessary. Now, as we staked that front edge down, every once in a while we would stop, make sure we didn't have any ripples or bubbles in that synthetic grass. If we did, we'd push them out both directions and then continue on putting the nails in. Once we got that entire front edge staked down, I went to both sides and the back of the grass and pulled it as tight as I could, once again to make sure I got as many ripples and bubbles out of it as I possibly could. Once I was happy with how tight the artificial grass was, we continued to put the stakes in around the outer edge and make the cuts as we went. So right here, I'm actually doing the cuts kind of around that second horseshoe pit and along the back side of it, which is about the most complicated part. So when I made that main cut to go along this back edge of the horseshoe pit, I did make sure it was a little on the big side so then I could lay it into position, push any ripples that were in the material out, and then I trimmed off the little bit of excess to make sure I had a tight fit. I used the same concept for around the raised planter. Once I had that front edge in place, I pushed all the ripples out, then basically cut it to the first brick up, making sure I was a little bit on the big side. Then I used either the razor knife or that pair of tin snips to cut slits all the way down to where the ground was, and then I went in and cut off a little bit of excess from there to give me a nice tight fit around this raised planter. So right here is the biggest mistake that I made during this entire project. And that is that I did not make sure that I had the grass facing the same direction as the main piece when cutting out these final 3 pieces around the raised planter. So right here, I'm cutting along with the grain of the grass. The problem is I actually put this one facing the opposite direction as the main piece. So right here, I'm cutting off the extra little bit of material that they put on the edge of the main piece of grass so I could seam these together, because I actually purchased this tape material to seam these, and that ended up being a bad decision. I wish I would have just got the caulking material and left that piece of fabric on the main piece of grass to seam these together. So if you choose to go with the caulking material, all you would do instead of cutting off this extra material, you would lay that down, put the caulking material over the top of that, and then lay the next piece of grass on top of that to help hold it together. Since I decided to go with the adhesive tape, I peeled back the main piece of grass so I could get it centered under both pieces. As we peeled back the film off of that tape, I used the same nails that I used for the landscaping fabric to hold that tape in position while we set the grass in place. And then we used the infill bags to hold that seam together as we made the final cuts around the raised planter. So quite honestly, I don't even know if you really need to use any type of an adhesive between the seams of the artificial grass. I actually talked to a gentleman that used to own a company that used to lay this grass down, and he said he had gotten to the point where he just used the nails to hold the seams together and not use any type of an extra adhesive. The only reason I decided to do an extra adhesive is because of my dogs. They are really aggressive when they play, and I just wanted that extra little holding power to help hold those seams together. So if I had a rewind button to do this project over, I would have used the caulking material to do the long seam where I'm pulling this tape right now, and then I would have used the adhesive tape for between the small sections going the other direction. So right here, we're just getting ready to set that second piece of artificial grass in place. And I really thought that making the seams line up correctly and having it look good as far as right at the edge was going to be a problem, but it actually went pretty smoothly. Another reason why I think the caulking would be the better option if you're doing a long seam is because if you do set it incorrectly, the caulking is going to allow you to kind of pick it up and put it back down without a problem. Whereas if you set it incorrectly on that tape, it's going to be a pain in the butt to unstick it from that without it pulling the tape out from underneath the other piece of grass and whatnot. So once again, for a long seam, I think the caulking is the better way to go. So here's a really good view of me making some of the cuts around the bricks in the raised planter. I actually triangulated these in between each brick, and it actually came out really clean. I was really happy with the end result. I was actually using just a straight pair of tin snips to make these cuts, and it actually worked really well. One thing I will say is make sure you wear gloves the entire time if you are going to use these tin snips to cut this grass, because I was 50-50 whether I was using the gloves or not to make these cuts, and I ended up with a huge blister on my finger. Granted, I made a lot of cuts in order to finish this project. One thing I did differently on this final piece of grass that worked really well is I made the rough cut and got that piece of grass pretty much the size it needed to be before going and putting the adhesive tape down, and that way it was just easier to handle while we were putting it in place. That did help out a bunch, and I wish I would have figured that out with the first extra piece that I had to lay instead of the last. Right here, we're just laying that final small piece of grass because they shorted me that extra foot, but there's nothing much I could do about it at this point, and I just wanted to get it done. So right here, I'm putting the final stakes in around the horseshoe pits, and I continued doing that all the way around the outer edge, including around the raised planter, probably every 4 to 6 inches. So I did end up with a little bit of a bubble in the grass on this front corner, so what I ended up doing is removing the stakes about 5 feet back so I could pull that bubble out. Then I staked it in at my horseshoe pit so I could pull more tension on the front edge. Once doing that, I restaked the front edge. I did end up having to trim off a little bit of the artificial grass towards the end because it ended up being a little long from pulling that bubble out. When putting the stakes in by where we seamed the grass together, I basically staggered the nails from side to side every 4 inches on each piece of grass. I really figured I didn't want to use very many of these landscaping stakes because I figured they were going to show in the grass. However, when you peel back the grass a little bit and then stake it in and then kind of push the grass back and forth, they basically disappear. Once realizing that, I used quite a bit of landscaping stakes because I just didn't want any of the seams or edges coming up. Once staking everything down, it's time to go ahead and put the infill in. The basic concept of the infill is to stand up the grass. We ended up using the stuff that was recommended to us by the people we got the artificial grass from. So I thought laying this infill in and spreading it around would have been pretty easy. It actually ended up being more of a pain than I thought it would be. It was recommended to me to get one of these seed spreaders on wheels in order to spread this stuff evenly throughout the grass. I didn't want to spend the extra $50 on something that I was only going to use the one time. And go figure, I used to have one when we used to have the Bermuda grass, and I'm like, I haven't used it in a couple of years, so I got rid of it on Craigslist for like $10. That's Dan's world right there. Anyways, because we didn't have that spreader, we tried several different ways of flinging that infill around. I tried throwing it, I tried flinging it, I tried twisting around in a circle. It all didn't work worth a crap. The actual most consistent way we found was I actually got one of the water strainers from our kitchen and poured it into that, and the wife kind of walked it around. That was actually the most consistent way we found. But it was kind of hard to follow her and do it while we were moving, so then we stopped and we'd still get a pile because as I was filling it, it was staying in one place. So if I had it to do all over again, I would have got one of these roll around seed spreaders to spread this. Now this is just because I was doing a pretty big area, so you'll have to judge that for yourself. Now I figured it wasn't that big of a deal that we had those piles. I figured the push broom would just push it right out. but it actually took a lot more effort with where that infill was really thick to work it out and make it so you couldn't feel those lumps of infill in the grass. So basically you just use a stiff bristle broom to spread that infill in and work it into the grass. As you push it into the grass, that's what makes the grass stand up. So right here you can see we had some piles of the infill, and I tried working that in with the broom, and even after I went over it, you can still see that infill, and you could feel that in your feet. So that's why it's so critical to make sure you spread this stuff as evenly as possible. Now because of this, I ended up having to go get one of the motorized brushes that's actually made to spread this infill in the artificial grass. Luckily enough, the gentleman that I had talked to that used to own the company still had one of these brushes, so I was able to borrow it. And that motorized broom did push all the big lumps of the infill right out of the grass. So this is about 2 weeks after laying the grass. Haven't had any issues besides that one piece of grass that you can still really see because I laid it the wrong direction. The other one is kind of working in and it is looking a little better, so hopefully over time that one will start doing the same. So if you do decide to lay this grass yourself, I would say the most critical things is make sure your grade, drainage, and flow are correct where you're going to put the grass. I highly recommend putting a weed barrier fabric down as well, because I have had some people tell me they have gotten a couple weeds up through their artificial grass, through the drainage holes in the grass. If you have to do any cuts, make sure you measure twice and cut once, and around any curved raised planters or anything like that, always cut it big to start, so you can trim off little by little to make sure you have a nice clean edge. If you're having to seam any other pieces of grass together, make sure that you have that grass going the same direction as the main piece of grass. Unlike me, that is by far the biggest mistake I made, and it pisses me off. And when spreading your infill, make sure you spread it as evenly as possible so you don't end up with big lumps of that stuff that you can feel with your feet when it's all said and done. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.